Imagine looking up in the sky and seeing nothing but birds, not hundreds, not thousands, millions. A flock so enormous that it could stretch for miles. People describe passenger pigeons flocks as being so large that they could darken the sky, and some taking hours or even days to pass overhead. And here is the part that almost impossible to believe. There were once an estimated 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons in North America. Billions. And in just over a century there were none. So how does an animal go from being one of the most abundant birds on the planet to becoming completely extinct? This is the story of passenger pigeon. For thousands of years, passenger pigeon lived across the forest of eastern North America. And they went like pigeons you see in the cities today. Passenger pigeons were fast, powerful flyers, and their most extraordinary feature wasn't their speed, it was their numbers. And they lived and moved in enormous colonies. During migration, huge flocks could gather together in numbers that are almost impossible for us to imagine today. One account of naturalist John James Audubon described a flock passing overhead for days. Imagine that. You look up and the birds just keep coming, hours after hours. The sky itself seems to be moving. At the time, nobody looking at this could have imagined that the species was in danger. Why would they? There were billions of them and then created a dangerous illusion. If there's this many, how could they possibly disappear? Passenger pigeons were also incredibly useful to humans. They were large birds, they were found in large concentrations, and they were relatively easy to hunt when they gathered together. So people hunted them for food. At first, they probably didn't seem like a serious problem. There were simply too many birds. If someone killed a few hundred, there were millions more. But eventually, hunting became much more efficient. Commercial hunters could target enormous colonies and sell the bird as cheap meat. The transportation was changing. Railroads made it easier for hunters to reach distant nesting ground and transport huge quantities of bird to market. Suddenly, an animal that had once been spread across enormous continent could be turned into commercial resource, and the killing became industrial at the scale. Here's where the story gets disturbing. At first, the population was so enormous that the damage wasn't obvious, and the numbers started falling. The billions became millions, and the millions became thousands. At the same time, humans were clearing forests for farms, towns, and other development. So the pigeons were losing both their numbers and their habitat. But there was another problem. Passenger pigeons had evolved around living in enormous groups. Their entire lifestyle depended on being incredibly social. They nested in huge colonies, they traveled in huge flocks, and their sheer number provided protection. When there were hundreds of thousands of birds together, losing a few to predator didn't matter much well. And when humans started killing them by thousands and then by millions, the advantage became weakness. The bird needed large population to thrive. And once their number fell far enough, this couldn't simply recover. By the late 1800s, the change was become impossible to ignore. The great flocks were disappearing, and suddenly, people who had grown up seeing millions of passenger birds were living in a world where seeing even one has become unusual. There were attempts to protect them, but they came too late. By the early 1900s, passenger pigeons had disappeared from wild. The last authenticated capture of a wild pigeon occurred in Ohio in 1900. After that, people searched for surviving birds. Rewards were even offered to find a nest or nesting colony, but nobody found one. The great flocks were gone. But there are still few passenger pigeons living in captivity. Eventually, there was only one, and her name was Martha. She lived in Cincinnati Zoo. Martha wasn't just an ordinary zoo animal. People knew she was represented. People knew what she represented, and she was believed to be the last living passenger pigeon. Visitors came to see her. There were long lines at the zoo because people understood that they were looking at something that wouldn't exist for much longer. A species was disappearing right in front of them, and there was nothing they could do. Attempts were made breed the remaining captive birds, but they failed. Passenger pigeons depended on large colonies, and keeping a tiny number of them in captivity wouldn't recreate the condition they needed. Other captive birds died, and eventually Martha was alone. For years, she remained the last known member of her species until September 1, 1914. The afternoon Martha was found dead on the floor of her enclosure. She was about 29-year old, and with her death, the passenger pigeons became extinct. Think about that for a second. A species that had once numbered somewhere between 3 and 5 billions had been reduced to one bird, and then zero. After Martha died, her body was preserved. It was transported to Smithsonian, where scientists carefully prepared her remains. Today, Martha's preserved specimens remain part of Smithsonian collection, and there was something strangely powerful about that. Because when you look at Martha, you're not looking at a rare bird; you're looking at the final individual of an entire species, the last one. There would never be another passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon stupidity isn't simply about people hunting too many birds. It's a combination of things: massive commercial hunting, habitat destruction, and something perhaps even more dangerous: the belief that there could never possibly be a problem. When you have billions of animals, it's easy to assume that billions will always be there, and the assumption can make people wait until it's too late. By the time passenger pigeons become obviously rare, there simply wasn't enough of them to recover. Their extinction became one of the events and helped push United States toward the stronger wildlife conservation. In 1900, Congress passed Lacey Act, which helped states protect wildlife by restricting interstate trade in illegal taken animal. The passenger pigeon was already on its way to extinction, but its disappearance helped people understand something that seems obvious to us now. Wildlife isn't infinite. So imagine going back in North America in the 1800s, you're standing in a forest, everything is quiet, and then you heard something. A distant rumble. It gets louder. You look up, and the sky begins to darken, not because of a storm is coming, because millions of pigeons are flying overhead. You watch them pass and pass and pass. You might think they will always be there, because how could something so numerous ever disappear? But a little more than a century later, a person could walk through the same continent and never see a single one. That's what makes passenger pigeon so haunting. It wasn't always rare, it wasn't always endangered, it wasn't some forgotten animal that quietly disappeared. It was once everywhere, and there were billions of them, and there were one, and then there was none. Maybe that's the real lesson of the passenger pigeon. Extinction doesn't always begin when something becomes rare. Sometimes it begins when something is so common that we assume it can never disappear. And the story of the passenger pigeon, billion to one, and then zero.